I'll begin at the beginning, because it's the only place to start. Once a long time ago, there was a little girl who wanted to be a storyteller. She loved to listen to stories, but when she tried to tell them, the words became all confused in her head, and they came out wrong, especially the beginnings. So she did what any little girl back then would do. She went to the old wise woman who lived at the edge of the forest, for in those days, the wise women always lived at the edge of the forest. She knocked on the door, and the old crone said, "What do you want from me?" The little girl said, "I want to be a storyteller." "Why?" The little girl thought, and she said, "I like the way the words sound when I speak them." "Not good enough," said the old crone. "Come back and give me a better reason." And the little girl left. The next day she came back and she said, "I like the things I see in my head when I tell." "Not good enough," said the old woman. "Come back again." The little girl went home, and she thought about it and thought about it. She tossed and she turned. She thought about the pictures she saw and the words that she heard, but she couldn't come up with another reason. The next day, when she was passing by the kitchen, she heard her grandmother telling her little brother a story. And when she looked in, she saw her grandmother's face. Grandmother looked as if she was remembering something from long, long ago, something so beautiful. And her little brother's face, he looked as if Grandma was sharing a secret with him, one he was hearing for the very first time. In their faces, she saw the reason. And she went to the old crone's house and knocked on the door. The wise woman let her in, and she stood by the fireplace. The old lady said, "Well, do you have a reason for me?" "I do," said the girl. "I want to tell stories that tell people who they are, where they came from, and where they can go." The old woman smiled and said, "That's a good reason. And you will be a fine storyteller. And now I will tell you the beginnings. You can start once a long, long time ago. Or you can say once upon a time. Or you can say it wasn't in my time, it wasn't in your time, but it was in someone's time. Or you can say before your grandmother's grandmothers were born. You can say any of these, all of these, or more. All you need to do is to bring the story from the past here to now." The little girl smiled, and she became a storyteller on the stage of her people's imaginations. In my mind, storytelling is probably the oldest art form. I can't think of anything that would predate it.
Think about, those cave drawings, and they were telling a story about the hunt. And so people would relate that way. And they would also keep their culture and oral history through storytelling. They had creation stories. They had stories about their ancestors. This was their history. This is how they kept their culture alive.
For most of its history, storytelling has literally been an oral tradition passed down around a campfire, around a hearth, around a table where families sat. You learned your stories on Grandma or Grandpa's knee, and they told you stories.
Before the Industrial Revolution, people would use storytelling to pass the time when they were doing, real manual labor. And so some of the stories got real bawdy and racy, but they were usually for adults. These weren't really for children.
And that's one of the big things we always hear. Oh, storytelling, that's for children. Well, no, it is, but it's also for adults.
They didn't turn into more children's type stories until the Grimm's brothers, when they wrote the Grimm's fairy tales. I think then people looked at stories, folk tales and fairy tales as more for children, but originally they weren't. Some of these stories were quite bawdy.
The Grimm's brothers, when they went out collecting, they were using stories, folk tales, as the basis for some of those. When they did that, they brought those stories into the light for the first time, some of those old German folk tales. And so storytelling's always been there, but it's been at the fringe of our society, inside the family, inside the community. And I think that that's one of its strengths. Storytelling is often denigrated because of this familial community basis.
Turtle
But now that it's gone into the realm of performance art, people are going, oh, this is a new art form, storytelling. And it's like, well, not really. You know, it's always been there. I mean, those stories, those traditional stories date back a long time. They've always been there. It's just new that we're doing it on stage into a microphone in front of an audience. That's the new part.
Lit the mountainside on fire.
Before that, we told stories around kitchen tables, campfires, you told stories to friends, but you didn't see many people get up on stage. You had people like Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, who would read excerpts from their books, but that was different. Storytelling is a whole different animal. You know, a storyteller gets up without a script. A storyteller looks at their audience. There's no wall between us. There's nothing on the screen at the theater. There's no pages. It's me and the audience. It's not a disembodied voice coming over the radio. These are all wonderful art forms, and I'm a big fan of all of them. But storytelling is personal. It's one-on-one, or it's 1 on 100, or whatever many people are in your audience. It has to be that way.
There's all different sorts of tales. Some of them are tales that they're sharing wisdom. Some of them are cautionary tales. Some of them are simply, you know, funny tales, silly tales.
5 pounds of salami right there on his table.
But I think deep down everyone can relate to the characters in the tales, and I think that's what makes it that common experience.
When I tell a story for an adult audience, that audience is going to hear that story, experience that story on a whole different level. For example, if I tell to a 10-year-old, they see it on one level, a 16-year-old on another, a 25-year-old on another, and so on. It's the layers of a story. It's like peeling away skin on an onion.
Slice it, dice it, you can boil it, stew it, fry it, or you can do just about anything with onions.
We've only been around 35, 40 years as a true performance art. There was a man in Jonesboro, Tennessee by the name of Jimmy Neal Smith, and he is a wonderful man. And Jimmy Neal had a dream 36 years ago to start a storytelling festival. And the first time there must have been 60 or 70 people standing in front of some hay bales in front of the courthouse. And now if you were to go to the National Festival, there might be 10, 12,000 people coming to the little town of Jonesboro, Tennessee to hear storytelling. It is the mecca of storytelling. Now we probably have maybe close to 300 storytelling festivals here in the United States. Now people say, well, that's a lot, but considering how huge we are and how spread out we are, it's not really that many. Not all of them are huge festivals that get 10,000 people. Some of them are just small, local festivals, a few hundred people. They're all great. I play from the tiniest festival to the biggest festival, and I love them all.
Storyteller, everybody come from everywhere, and it'd be great. What do you think, huh?
Many, many, many storytellers mentor other people. They invite them into their homes. They meet once or twice a year. They go over stories. They help them develop stories, help them develop their own style. Mentoring is a very big part of storytelling.
Apprenticeship is very valuable because they'll teach you, you know, some of the things to look for in a story, how to interpret the story, what to, you know, how to choose a story. And one of the things that you do when you choose a story is pick one that you really, really love or like or relate to, that's going to pop for you. And if you choose a story you don't like, you won't tell it very well.
There are certain subjects I'm just not comfortable with. You know, I don't tell love stories that well.
My stories tend to be stories with a twist. I like the clever story.
Ghost stories, horrible stories about mass murders and dismemberment, you know, like Mr. Fox. Oh, I love stories like that. But if it comes down to a love story, you know, I sit there and go, oh.
So those are the types I like. I do like the personal tales.
And if you tell stories you don't like, you'll never do a decent job of them. You'll always be just a little below where your other stories are. So it's better to concentrate on the stories you really, really like.
If you want to get someone's attention, you know, if you say, once upon a time, you've got their attention.
I really like what happens with an audience when I tell stories. I like the idea that we're sharing the story, that we're each seeing it in a different way, that we're creating it together. That co-creative part of storytelling is so important. And when I see it in my audience's eyes, to me that's worth everything. I guess that's why I tell stories.
It's a lot of fun. They kind of feed you their energy when they laugh or they get the turn in the story, and that just is very gratifying. And so there's that interaction of that appreciation that's going on, that you know that the story hit home and you know that you made someone laugh, and I think that's, for me, very rewarding.
Once they see a good storyteller, once they hear a good story, I think they'll get hooked. I think that they'll understand why it's so powerful, why people use it in therapy now, why people use it with different healing processes. Why storytelling is so important to people. But you have to give it a chance. You have to realize that I'll walk in, I'll sit down, I'll relax, and I'll open my head. And if people do, they're going to be surprised about what's going to fall in.